But welcome, Vanessa. It's an absolute pleasure to have you as a guest on the Recruitment Marketing and Sales podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Sharon.
You're very welcome. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. I know that it's a big topic, and we could go down lots of different avenues with it. But it might be that today is a starting point for this conversation, and we revisit it at some time. But listen, before we dive in, I'd love to just get you and invite you to just introduce yourself and just share with our audience a little bit more about you, your background. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Perfect. Thank you. So my name is Vanessa Vasilakakis, and you don't have to attempt my last name. You can just call me Vanessa. I work at the McQuaig Institute, and we help companies make better hiring decisions. And we do that through our suite of psychometric assessments. We measure personality and cognitive ability. And these are things that are really relevant in not just recruitment, but overall talent management, because personality is something that actually is really predictive of performance on the job. Today, I oversee operations at McQuaig. I've been with the company for about 10 years. Before that, I started my career and for many years was supporting recruitment functions within organizations, much of that from an agency perspective. I have most of my experiences in contingency search.
Right.
I've done a little bit of retained search. And when I joined McQuaig, it was a really good fit because now I got to be on the side of still supporting placements and hiring, but now maybe supporting the recruitment firms themselves.
Absolutely. And it's great actually, with your background, because today's conversation is very much looking at certainly something that we have seen probably in the last couple of years, and particularly with our own client group this year, is an evolution towards introducing a retained service as an option alongside, contingency, potentially, contracting or temp, but also, companies perhaps who are introducing it as a service with a long-term goal of actually transitioning their business much more towards, a retained service. So I'd like to kind of chat with you about that today, and also about how, as companies look to perhaps develop their service offerings, the kind of resources that McQuaig provides can actually be a really, really valuable resource. Because I think, again, a lot of companies talk about, we want to stand out, we want to be different, we don't want to be a service provider, we want to be a partner, we want to have, bigger, more strategic level conversations, but perhaps struggle to sit at the table and have that kind of conversation. And so, I think when we met and we were chatting, the whole retain conversation and what you guys do just seems to align really well. So maybe a starting point, with your sort of years of experience here, is what do you find generally drives that decision from a business owner's perspective to start moving towards a retained or look at introducing a retained offer? What's behind that business decision?
Mm-hmm. And I suspect, Sharon, you've got a lot of experience here as well. You probably have an answer, and I wonder if we have the same answer. I think it's usually driven by just a desire for more certainty in revenue. I've been on the contingency and the retain side, and I can tell you, and anybody in search knows this, it's the same amount of work. It's a lot of work on both sides.
Yeah.
And on the one side, you don't have any guaranteed revenue. I also think that you already touched on this in the introduction. There is this desire to be viewed as less of a vendor and more of a partner. And that is more difficult to achieve, I think, with contingency search models.
Mm. And And it's interesting as well because, as I was listening to you and just thinking about, what do I see is driving it as well, and something perhaps that, when you look at when we first came into the market, sort of like 15, 16 years ago, I think there were about 8,000 recruitment companies in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
There's around 35,000 companies today.
Wow.
That is just phenomenal. When you think about the population of the UK and you think about the population of the US, which is 323 million versus 69 million.
Yeah.
And we have roughly the same number of recruitment companies. I'm not quite sure how many you have in Canada.
I'm not even sure myself. I think that's a staggering number, though.
Yeah,
And it just goes to show it's a very competitive industry, and
it is.
it highlights the need for strong differentiation if you want to compete at
Yeah.
a high level.
And I think, with that, because of that increased level of competitiveness, I think it's probably heightened that sense of, we're, in fact, somebody mentioned this word to me in a client call earlier, fighting for kind of like jobs, and it's like you put all that effort in, and like you say, you're not going to get paid. That individual was talking about competing with like 10 other agencies, and had
Mhm.
just decided, well, I'm not doing it. It's just kind of not
Yeah.
worth my effort. And so I think there are, multiple factors that is driving it. There are, I hear, and I'm sure you've heard it and you've sold it, so you may well have experienced this, but often there can be hesitation from owners and the team members that they have around the objections that they might get from clients when they position a retained offer.
Mhm.
And sometimes people are super confident at handling that, and sometimes less so. I wonder if that's putting people off from really kind of like going for it. I mean, what's your experience, in terms of the kinds of objections that maybe they might come across, and how do they handle those?
Mhm. I think the number one objection has to do with paying upfront without guaranteed results, right? Especially if that's the relationship that the client has become used to.
Mm,
I think the best way to address that, it it comes from showing the difference in the value, because there is a difference in the service you'll be able to give with a retained search.
yeah.
By applying things like service level uh, agreements into your contract, that can be helpful to
Mm,
get beyond that client objection. And of course, guarantees when a placement is made. How do we guarantee that placement?
mm,
What I've seen a lot of folks do as well, and particularly those who are trying to make this transition, is maybe adopt a hybrid model at first. And there is a portion of fees that are paid up front, but then there's a portion that's paid on successful placement. So now we've got some assurance that both of us, have the expression person I report into always makes is, we both have a dog in the game, or a dog in the hunt. um, and to share that risk with your customer might help get over that objection.
yes. Yeah.
And it is also useful. I mentioned, like, you might actually be minimizing some risks if you're in a retained partnership. It, by definition, it will be a somewhat elevated partnership,
Mm.
and there will be greater collaboration. It's going to result in better placements.
So thinking about companies who want to, introduce and evolve a retained offer.
Mhm.
Historically, they've generally been working contingency, I would say predominantly. So when they're going to a prospective client or they're going to an existing client who's been used to, as you say, a particular way of working, how do they begin to, look at their service offering, look at what additional value, because you mentioned that word value, how do they add additional value into that service offering to justify, a different level of fee, a different level of working? Yeah.
Being somebody here that's from McQuaig, I see how our customers use our products as part of
Mm,
that value add. And I will say most leading search firms do incorporate some form of behavioral or cognitive assessment
right.
into their offering.
Process. Yeah.
Our customers embed our tools at really every stage of the search. And we're not the full picture of how
Mm,
they level up that offering, but we're a part of it. They use our tools to help really understand client needs, and
mm,
that's something that can sometimes get missed with some contingent search offerings. Maybe our intake meetings aren't as robust as if we were in a retained relationship where we do have that partnership with the customer.
mm,
Getting that alignment up front benefits everybody. Um, Leveraging these tools, then once we've got alignment, we move into candidate search. We're uncovering gaps to profiles that we're looking for early in. So we're presenting better candidates to the customer. We can support their interviews. One of the things that, and I always see nodding heads when I speak with search firms, and I mention this, in my experience, the customers I worked with were really great at what they did, and hiring was a small part of their job, and they weren't always great at hiring. If there are ways for us to meet the customer where they are, and give them some easy to use tools to level up their interview skills,
mhm.
that can be a big help in them making the right hiring decision.
Yeah.
And then finally, I'm seeing firms provide some post placement services. And I think that can be really impactful. And depending on the level that you're providing, it might even be a new product offering or a product line that
Right.
search firms can take on.
Yeah. And thinking of what you've described, it might be that there are some listeners who are thinking, well, that sounds great, and aren't those kinds of products and services, perhaps the kind of the McQuaig offering, let's say, are they not more suited to larger um, you know, larger SMEs, smaller corporates, kind of like the big companies, so to speak? Is it really for a small, a micro and a smaller business? How would you speak into that?
I would say absolutely. We work with search firms and we also work with HR departments. And today, as I'm overseeing product development at McQuaig, there's two things that are really important to me. Number one, all our products need to be accessible,
Mm,
meaning the results come through in easy to understand, plain language. You don't need to have high level specialized training to interpret the results. We also want them to be actionable.
yeah,
So we don't give just a 45-page report and say have fun interpreting what to do with
yeah,
that. We have practical interview guides. We've got practical job fit information. And the intention there in designing the tool that way, most large companies, they probably have somebody on staff who's an expert in this sort of assessment. Smaller companies don't. So that's the first thing that makes our tools suitable for smaller businesses. But second, it can really scale with you. You've got options to implement additional services, start utilizing, different pieces of the information that come out of these tools. Ultimately, if it's embedded in your full offering, we can make it pretty painless to help you achieve those value add pieces on where it fits in.
Yeah. And so thinking then about you've talked about assessment tools and profiling, etc. So maybe just help us understand about how can you use assessment tools to predict future behavior. It's interesting, when I think back to my corporate days and interviewing everything, and I have interviewed since, but we always talk about asking questions that are related on past experience to evidence behavior, and then here we are talking about predictive behavior. So I just wonder if you could just maybe share a little bit about from your expertise on that.
Yeah. And two pieces of the puzzle that are both really important, right? The best predictor of what you'll do tomorrow is what you did yesterday. That's why we rely heavily on behavioral based interviewing. And in fact, our interview guides are filled with behavioral based interview questions. The assessment in isolation isn't the full answer, but it can help. And I think there's on the journey to making a placement, there's two key areas where these tools can be really helpful. The first is getting stakeholder alignment. So before we even start looking at any candidates, again, going back to my recruitment days, I found always that, and you've heard me say this before, Sharon, my customers were always really good at outlining for me, what's the education I need? What's the experience I need? What are the hard qualifications? And they weren't always as good at defining what's the right fit. What are the behavioral demands of a role? And funny thing is, it was very rare that I would submit a candidate to a customer and they would say, oh gosh, no, I'm going to turn this one down because the experience is misaligned. Far more common when they didn't proceed with a candidate, it was the fit wasn't right. And it's hard to define. It's not that they don't want to tell you. It's that sometimes people don't really have the words. Using assessment tools, you can actually draw that information out of your client stakeholders, and you might actually discover some misalignment between those stakeholders. Misalignment that they might not have even been aware of. And you can come to some consensus before you start a search. So I think that's a really valuable part of all this.
Absolutely.
And then second to that, once you've actually got the consensus, when we start assessing candidates and comparing them up against that benchmark, you're getting beyond, again, the skills and experience, and you're looking at whether they have the right behavioral makeup to address the behavioral demands of a role. The assessment shouldn't be your decision maker, but when it highlights gaps, it raises flags, and then it allows you to explore with some good, strong interviewing, explore those areas to really make sure that you're confident you have the right fit in the candidate.
So it's not, so if I understand you there, it's not a case of, oh, we'll profile some, this is kind of like the benchmark of what we're looking for. We'll profile someone, and unless they are a perfect fit, then it's a no. What you're saying is, well, how do they align? And let's explore the differences, because actually we could work with some of those differences. Just how do we work with those differences? How might a manager manage those differences? How might we leverage those differences in a way that we haven't really considered? So it's almost like using it, as you say, to facilitate a conversation, to explore how that person could align, but how you would deal with the difference, rather than just eliminating somebody because they're different to what that benchmark is, I think is the word that you used.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just about us leading the search doing that. It's also about linking that back to the customer. So, you know, you can go to the stakeholder team and say, you all agreed, we're looking for somebody, for example, very assertive for this role. I've got this candidate that's come through, and from a behavioral perspective, they're actually not very assertive. I've interviewed them and I dug deep and I explored that area. I actually think they could be a very good fit for you, but it's really important in your interview that you
Right.
also dig deep into this area.
Yeah.
They may not have.
Yeah.
Had you not highlighted that potential flag for them, it lets them conduct a better informed interview, resulting in a better informed hiring decision.
Yeah. And so when companies use assessment tools like we're talking about with McQuaig, from the years that you've worked with them, and I guess compared to when before you joined McQuaig and everything, and you'd sold retained and worked retained, what impact can it make in for a business in terms of search? Because we've all kind of had the stories that I've heard, where you put so much work in and the candidate falls down at the last stage, or they start and they're gone within a month or two, and it's like, oh, we're back to, that's just so painful, isn't it? Nobody wants that.
You're doubling up your work. And it's probably bad for your brand as well, because not only is it the customer, but now on the candidate side as well, obviously they had some sort of gap in their experience.
Mm,
Um, with better assessment, and that comes down to not just the assessment tool, but
yeah.
also enabling your customer to just have a less biased, more robust interview process.
Hmm.
I've seen some of my customers reduce their fall offs to almost zero. And as a result of that, if you know you're not going to have fall offs, you can extend your guarantees. That then makes you more competitive to get more retained customers. If I can offer a 2-year guarantee where my competitors only offer 6 months, that's a huge differentiator.
It certainly is. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So how else then do you think? Let's think about, if companies. Let me just shorten the question. Actually, what other, I guess, examples of ROI have you seen? Because you talk about, you were mentioning at the beginning, about, obviously, there's the assessment, but it's not just about the assessment. It's about the interview process. But then somebody is onboarded. And you were saying that it's about how can a company partner with their client through the bigger, longer part of that life cycle, should we say, of an employee. So do you want to maybe just expand on what you mean by that? Because that would contribute significantly to ROI for the client, wouldn't it?
The post placement value.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And that is a big part of reducing the turnover too. It's
Right.
really common that after placements are made, we follow up on a schedule. How are you doing to the candidate? How are you liking it? Or are you fitting in okay?
Mm.
It's a casual conversation, and maybe something similar to the customer as well. Our customers that we've seen implement these tools really effectively, they go but beyond the placement, and they make those post-placement interactions valuable for the customer, valuable for the new placement. And in doing that, they're gathering really useful data so they can start mitigating some of the potential flags that could arise. One of the things that our customers do in the onboarding process, and I do this personally at McQuaig as well with all new hires, I expose my results to my new employee. We look at their results and we talk about how we're going to interact with one another based on our different styles. Based on my personality, there's a certain way I prefer people to report into me and present information to me. If a new employee knows that from day one, we're setting each other up for success.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some of my customers approach this in a really consultative way, and they sit down and facilitate the conversation. But that's not even necessary. You can do it in a really low stakes way and just provide them with some of their results from these tools.
Mm.
The other thing I've seen that's been really impactful, we talked about creating that benchmark profile. This is what's required for the role. Well, sometimes we hire somebody who isn't a perfect match. Post-hire, post-onboarding, instead of calling the candidate up and saying, how's it going? How are you liking it? What if you were to say, hey, remember that assessment you took in the hiring process? Let me show you your results. And let me also show you, here's the benchmark we were looking for. And you had a few gaps. We hired you because we know you're going to be fantastic for all these reasons.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to show you this because it's very likely that as you start to get settled in your role, you're going to see some of these things come up as challenges. And I just want you to be prepared for that before these things arise. Again, that doesn't have to be all that much longer than the phone call that you're already making, but it's a lot more impactful, and it helps you mitigate some of the potential bumps in the road that could lead to a fall off.
Yeah. And something I think, let's say, sort of like not well from let's say from a recruitment company, search company's perspective here. Sometimes when you're using tools, we know that the exec search process and retain process, it is more high touch.
Yeah.
I guess my question is, how do you balance the tech part of the process and things getting a little bit involved in techie with the people part of it and the high touch part of it? Because I guess it might be that some people kind of have a little bit of hesitation. This could be a search owner and it could be a client that they're talking to, that they don't want the tech and the process to kind of like cause some friction and slow down the process. But because really what we want to do here is use them to enhance the process and get the results that you've been sharing with us. So I don't know if that's anything that you've experienced.
We're in a human industry.
Yeah.
Tech is amazing, and we're seeing advancements all the time. I was interacting with GPT the other day, and they just launched a new feature set, and there's lots of cool stuff happening there, but we're in a human industry. Even, in the assessment space, I guess you could say McQuaig is kind of like a tech company, but we're not. We're a human company.
Yeah.
And creating some balance there, it is important. I think one of the biggest complaints that we hear from folks that are looking for jobs is just the interviewing and the application procedure can be cold. When you're submitting information into an ATS and you're taking assessments and maybe you're getting automated responses back, if anything at all, that's very cold. And while some companies that hire direct might be okay with that being, their employer brand and the experience that candidates go through, those in search can't take that risk, right?
Yeah.
It's so important to connect meaningfully with your candidates, because who knows, that candidate might be your next customer one day.
You never know.
They also might refer if they're fantastic, they've probably got fantastic friends. They might refer some folks to you that you'd love to work with. So the balance is important. The tech, whether it's an assessment tool or anything else, should support the human element, not replace it. We just did a webinar on this topic, and I had a few panelists that had a lot of tech experience, but it's we're humans, right? We're in
Yeah.
human industries, and that can't go away. McQuaig can help with some of the reporting options that we have that you can feed back to candidates, again, in such a way that it doesn't have to be a lot of additional work for you, that
Mhm.
can really enhance the candidate experience. We don't want our candidates to feel like they're submitting information into a black hole, you know?
No,
We
no.
need to give them feedback and guide them through the process in a
Yeah.
human way.
And I think, even it was interesting because I was on a call with a client recently, and they were talking about their daughter, who is, let's say, second year in university and applying for internships. And so we're talking about a Gen Z person here, brought up on tech and everything else. And gosh, they'd made something like 20 plus applications, and they hadn't had one interaction with a human being. So everything, beyond that initial application, it was all, to a screen, to a computer. It was just so depersonalized. And it was
Yeah.
interesting because this young person was saying that, well, this is not what I want. I might be Gen Z, I might be brought up on tech, but actually this is so impersonal that I'm not inspired to join any of these companies. And these were some rather large, good
Mm-hmm.
global organizations. And you think, well, yeah, I get that there are some roles where you might want to do um, some testing, some skills-based testing, etc., but this individual was several stages down the process, and with many of these companies, and had never spoken to a person. And it just think, we're kind of like, we need to be careful here a little bit, don't we? you know
Yeah.
um so yeah, it's a balance. Let me just kind of like perhaps circle almost like back to the beginning in a way, because a lot of we seem to be having more and more conversations and hearing clients talking about this desire to be seen as a partner, not a vendor. um, and and yet perhaps are unsure. They might have some good relationships, but moving that relationship on to the
Mhm.
point where they can sit down with several stakeholders perhaps and have that bigger, more strategic conversation about, where is the organization going? What are their people plans? Um, what are they thinking in terms of recruitment needs, etc.? How have you got any guidance that you could share with listeners around how do they begin to maybe open up a discussion that could lead them down that path? Because I think a lot of people do struggle with how to open up a bigger conversation.
Well, and this does circle back to the beginning, because this is the it's a requirement if you want to shift from more of a contingency model to a retained model. And I think that the key to shifting the dynamic from, I'm just a vendor versus now I'm a partner, it comes down to demonstrating the value of
Yeah.
having alignment and collaboration up front. And I would think that starting by framing the intake meeting as, this is a mutual strategy session. It's not just procedure. It's not just, you giving me an order at a restaurant.
Mm.
This is strategic, and it's where we're going to work together to define success. We're going to have the chance to clarify the role. We're going to understand expectations on my side and your side regarding timing and process, and process, like process does come into it.
Yeah.
And then most importantly, what makes a candidate fit?
Yeah.
Coming back to the fit, it's not a list of qualifications when we know 99 times out of 100, when we turn a candidate down, it's usually fit. So what is that? I think that a way to encourage the partnership mindset could be to illustrate to the customer how misalignment can lead to
Yeah.
mistakes, can lead to bad hires, can lead to delayed timelines, and really to detail that the intake meeting, that's the opportunity to understand beyond just this candidate, how does that fit into the business goals, the team dynamics, the culture. You're going to deliver better results if you understand that.
Yeah.
I also think that you can make it a bit more compelling if you're prepared to come to the table with insights. So deliver value in the meeting. One of the ways that McQuaig customers do that is by sometimes identifying misalignment that the customer didn't even know that they had, different stakeholders with misalignment. I think that for those listening, you have expertise beyond that as well. Like, you know about compensation across the market, you know about um, generalized market trends. That information can be really valuable to the customer. And that should be, something that you speak about in positioning the value of doing this.
And 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 that's really interesting in terms of you saying about how upfront you might be able to help that client identify some misalignment among stakeholders. It reminds me of a client who and this is part of retained, and I accept this when I share this story. However, as I was listening to you, it made me think, could a mini version of this happen even if people are starting to develop a contingency or an exclusive service? So what this individual does is, let's say, however many stakeholders there are, before any kind of like brief is taken, there is an individual interview which each of those stakeholders to get their view of where the business is at, what the issue is that this individual role that they're hiring for is going to be, let's say, key to resolving. And it's almost like taking an individual brief from each stakeholder. And that is about checking, as you absolutely point out, Vanessa, where there's alignment and where there are gaps. Because then that facilitates a conversation along the lines of, well, somebody might be thinking that this role is going to head off in one direction, and another stakeholder's got a completely different view, and they only meet in a couple of areas. So I suppose it makes me think, well, is it practical for someone perhaps who's working contingent or maybe even exclusive, that actually they could have a shorter conversation with some stakeholders that potentially could identify some differences?
I think that it's not going to be overnight that you move from a full contingent model to, a full retained model. And by starting to embed some of these value adds and also attitudes of being a partner versus being a vendor, that's part of the journey to get there. And I like that idea of interviewing the stakeholders separately. Now, there's a commitment to that. That's going to take you now more time. I would argue that it's going to save you time in the long run because you're going to make better placements because of it. If you lean into that extra work up front, your customer's going to notice, I think. And maybe the next time a search comes around, they might think, you know what? Sharon really understands us. She understands what we're looking for, and we know she digs deep. Let's not go to Bob and Walter. Let's just go to Sharon this time.
Yeah. And so just thinking then, there are lots of companies out there who are, probably practicing and making that transition towards retained, maybe just introducing retained as an additional offer, and also have made that shift and are working far more retained now, but want to keep evolving their offer. And of course, everything that we've been talking about today, is something that they could add in. All the McQuaig suite of tools would be invaluable. How can someone find out more about the McQuaig tools? Get in touch with yourselves.
Go to McQuaig.com and click on take a demo. Would be happy to show anybody what the assessment looks like. They can check out the candidate experience and also see their own results. Not just used for hiring, but also self-awareness and development. So the more we know about ourselves, the better. And would be thrilled to have a conversation. I think, Sharon, one thing you mentioned that I want to touch on instead of just giving my pitch for McQuaig. It is increasingly important, even if you've made that shift to fully retained, you have to, it's such a competitive environment that if you don't have differentiation in your offering, it's going to be really hard to attract new customers. You'll nurture all of those existing relationships, but it'll be customer acquisition becomes more and more difficult. The post-placement services, I think, are one of the big keys to that differentiation. And a tool like McQuaig can really help enable those activities in a low effort way, low effort and high impact to the customer.
Yeah. And I think that's where, perhaps, when certainly when I've been at conferences, this last sort of 12, 18 months, there's a lot of conversation around, how as an industry and companies, how we evolve, how we stay ahead. And that is, shifting, I suppose, what we're known as. And it's not just a case of being a recruitment company, but being a partner that can work with a client at that whole stage. Now, that doesn't mean to say that suddenly you need to become, an NLP trainer or a coach or anything, because we can collaborate with people. But it's almost like, and I have used this, I have heard this phrase used. It's not my favorite, and I get the idea of it. And that is almost like being a one-stop shop. But if it means that your client, you've got such a partnership relationship with them that they can come to you as the port of call when they are hiring, you're part of their onboarding process. But then, it's a case of, well, look, we need to look at some development now. Who can you introduce us to that will align and fit with us and our culture? And so you are much more that consultant, that partner. And I think that's how companies really need to be thinking to have some competitive advantage, but actually to bring about that transition from a transactional way of working to consultancy, because it's only if they do that are they going to head then in that direction of being a partner.
You want to be regarded as an extension of their team.
Absolutely.
You're an extension that understands who they are and what they need. I love the idea of partnership. And you know what? If you see a lot of success, maybe you will end up hiring your first coach a year from now.
Well, you never know. Yeah, never say never is kind of like what I always say. Absolutely. So listen, thank you so much for your time and insights today. And just a quick reminder, if anyone is really interested in finding more about McQuaig and the kind of work that Vanessa and her team do, then please visit mcquaig.com. I suspect we can extend this conversation at another time as well. Still lots of questions whizzing through my mind. But listen, thanks for your time today. It's been great chatting, and we'll speak soon.
Thank you so much for having me, Sharon.
You're welcome.